Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Today, I wanted to continue a segment where I talk a little bit about what I think of mechanics in tabletop role-playing games and how they can relate to storytelling. There is a lot of interesting stuff in tabletop RPGs, not all of which you can really use in traditional narrative. It's a very collaborative setting. It's a very random setting. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But even though it has all of these other elements added to it that you wouldn't have when writing prose or writing theater or a comic or things like that, it has a lot of interesting ideas that you can try and represent in your prose or in your dialogue that are really worth thinking about. And today, as I said, I want to talk a little bit about how we represent fate or chance, or the elements that our characters have no control over. So to do that, I want to look at the Savage World system. The Savage World system is extremely simple, so I'm going to explain the relevant parts in their entirety. Everything that a character can do in Savage Worlds is represented by a single die. That die can have anywhere from 4 sides to the traditional 6 sides, all the way up to 12 sides. And when that character wants to do something that is so difficult there's a chance of failure, you roll the related die. There aren't a whole lot of these. Savage Worlds is a very simple system. Sometimes you will add a +1 or a +2 to represent that the character is extremely competent at a thing, or they have a piece of equipment or some kind of specialized knowledge or something that makes them even better than the average person at doing this task. But beyond that, it's a simple die roll. Now, under normal circumstances, just having a single die roll with little to no modification would not give you a great chance of success. However, the Savage World system gives you a second die you can always roll. It's called the Wild die, and that is a traditional 6-sided die. When you roll these dice together, you only use one of the results. You use whichever one is higher. For a typical task in Savage Worlds that has a chance of failure, you have to roll a 4 or a higher on your die in order to succeed. So with your 6-sided die, you have a 50-50 shot of success. If you roll a 4, a 5, or a 6, you succeed at what you want to do. Now, if you have a 8-sided die, or a 10-sided die, or a 12-sided die, that means you're extremely well trained and you have a much better than 50-50 shot at success with your natural skills. But there is still a chance that you will succeed through circumstances beyond your control, which is what the Wild die represents. Maybe you just weren't doing well that day, but somebody left a key by a door you're trying to pick the lock on. Or to give a less extreme example, perhaps you're trying to drive your car at 100 miles an hour through an alleyway, and you're not really a great driver, but it just so happens that the alleyway has ruts down the middle because it rained the night before and someone drove a heavy truck through there. So there are ruts in the mud, and you can just kind of go down the ruts and get through the alleyway. This allows for an element of chance to be represented in your game that goes beyond simply rolling the die and that representing how good or bad you are at something. It's very useful for the game master to think about while they are resolving checks. You think, well, if my party member did this with their skill die, maybe I talk about how good they are at doing something. If they did it through their wild die, maybe I represent how chance has made this task very easy. And then if they fail on both of their dice, you really get a sense for how badly they failed. And that is the part I really want to talk about here. In general, one of the biggest similarities between the protagonist of a tabletop RPG and the protagonist of any other work of fiction is that they are exceptional in some way. They have something that sets them apart from the crowd. And while tabletop RPGs are typically about extremely exceptional people, they are really not any more exceptional than any good fictional protagonist is in their field of choice. So maybe your tabletop RPG hero is extremely competent in a wide number of things, and your protagonist from regular fiction is competent only in a handful of things. But the extreme nature of that competence is really pretty much the same. Gandalf is extremely competent in the realm of magic, just as Columbo is extremely competent in the realm of solving murders. And while, yes, magic is much more world-shaping than solving a murder can be, and in most circumstances, their level of competence compared to the other people doing these things is not really that different. Columbo is extremely good at solving murders. Gandalf is extremely good at using magic to solve the problems of Middle-earth. The scope and scale of the things their competence allows them to do is different, very different. But the level of competence is roughly the same. And you need to think about this as you show why your characters are succeeding and failing. Now, most of the time, it's good to have your characters fail because something conspired against them. There was somebody actively working against them to prevent them from getting what they want. This builds conflict, which is the heart of most story. However, sometimes your characters are just going to fail because circumstances are against them. That shouldn't be really common. When it is, though, you want to think in terms of the wild die in Savage Worlds. You want to think of a big, spectacular failure. This is not something that should happen every day. This is not something that should be even maybe a common part of your story. This should be something unique, something that kind of stands out to the reader as a sign that, yes, even these people, these very competent, very well-versed people, are sometimes at the whims of the world around them. That makes them a bit more relatable. At the same time, no game master builds a scenario around the idea that their players are going to fail any particular die roll. Yes, that's going to happen. That is part of the tabletop gaming experience. But you don't build your plans with that in mind. You can exploit it when it happens, because that makes the game more fun. But when you are telling a story entirely in fiction, you are the dice. You are the random element that should be meddling with these characters, and you cannot put your thumb on the scale in any big way. So this is the other thing. Don't build your stories around some kind of random event taking place. Those should be really rare, and they really shouldn't put their thumb on the scales one way or another. Now, it's okay if a antagonist sees something random that happened to the protagonist and tries to exploit it, or vice versa. That can then build an interesting encounter. But it shouldn't be something your characters are planning on, and it shouldn't be too deep into your story if it's going to be of significance to the plot. At that point, you're just straining believability, and you run the risk of losing your audience. By the same token, game masters in tabletop RPGs try not to just award their NPCs critical hits or things like that so that they can mess with players and make an encounter more difficult. That is something they catch on to very quickly, and people stop feeling like they're playing a game against fictional antagonists, and they start looking at you as the antagonist, which is not really the role of the traditional dungeon master or game master in a tabletop RPG. Some people do see it that way. I have not found that a very great way to play. I don't recommend it. I suppose that if it is what you want, maybe this lesson is not as applicable. I have found that RNG, and especially the way the Savage World system mitigates against it in favor of the player, is a very good way to think about having random chance mess with the characters in your stories. It's okay, and it can even be interesting, but it shouldn't be the heart and soul of the story, and you should try and keep it pretty rare, because these are very competent people we want to see doing their thing. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. There's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can use those as you see fit. And you can let me know in the comments what your favorite randomness mitigation aspect of a tabletop RPG is. I happen to think that the Savage World system is pretty good, although not necessarily the best for every system. I'm looking at you, 5th edition. But let me know what you think. I'll talk to you later.